Open your mind. Let the conversation begin.
Welcome back to The Deep Dive. It is absolutely fantastic to have you with us today.
It's great to be here.
If you're joining us for the first time, this is a place where we take a massive stack of articles, research papers, and, some really dense reports.
Very dense.
And we try to squeeze all the juice out of them so you don't have to. We are looking for those nuggets of insight that make you the smartest person in the room.
Or at least the most interesting person at the dinner party.
That is the goal. And today we have a topic that is going to require us to do some serious mental gymnastics.
I think that's putting it mildly.
Serious gymnastics. We're going to ask you, the listener, to do something a little difficult right off the bat. We need you to turn off the part of your brain that lights up when you hear political buzzwords. You know, the words that make you immediately think blue team or red team, liberal or conservative.
Which is, that's much harder than it sounds in the current climate.
It is incredibly hard. And the word we're dealing with today is sanctuary.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Now, usually when you hear the phrase sanctuary city, your brain probably goes to one specific place. You're thinking immigration, you're thinking the southern border, you're thinking about a very specific type of left-wing politics.
Right. It's become a shorthand, a bumper sticker almost. Depending on which news channel you watch, it's either a humanitarian imperative or a complete breakdown of law and order.
Exactly. But today, we are flipping that script. We are throwing that partisan lens out the window. We're looking at sanctuary not as a political stance, but as a mechanism, a machine.
A tool.
A tool, yeah. Specifically, a tool of local power used to jam the gears of federal or state authority.
And that is really the only way to understand what's happening in the American legal system right now. Because if you only look at it through the lens of immigration, you are missing like half the movie.
You really are.
The sources we have for this deep dive reveal a fascinating mirror image. We're seeing the exact same legal arguments, the exact same philosophical justifications, and, the exact same administrative tools being used by very different groups for completely opposite reasons.
It really is wild when you lay them side by side. We are talking about everyone from progressive mayors in New York City protecting undocumented immigrants,
Right.
to conservative sheriffs in rural Utah protecting gun rights.
It is the ultimate example of the horseshoe theory in American politics, where the extremes on both sides end up meeting in the middle on tactics.
Yeah.
They're both using the power of no. They're both using the power of the local jurisdiction to tell the big bad central government to back off.
So here's our mission for this deep dive. We aren't just going to define the term. We are going to pop the hood and look at the engine.
Get our hands dirty.
We need to unpack how a sanctuary actually works, mechanically, legally, and operationally. We're going to trace the history of the concept in one of America's biggest cities to see how it evolved from a simple privacy rule into a full-blown blockade.
And then we're going to pivot. And this is the part that I think will surprise a lot of people.
Right. We're going to see how that exact same concept has mutated and spread to over 70% of U.S. counties in a completely different context, gun rights.
It is a massive shift in the American legal landscape that I think a lot of people haven't fully grasped the scale of yet.
No.
We're talking about a fundamental question. Who actually decides which laws are enforced in your neighborhood? Is it the person you elected to Congress, or is it the person you elected as sheriff?
To get us there, we have a serious stack of sources today. We've got a historical timeline of New York City policies going back to the 80s.
Yep.
We have a breakdown of how constitutional sanctuaries operate, and we have an operational guide to the friction between local police and federal IC agents.
Which is a very, very tense interface.
Absolutely. So let's dive right in.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we get into the history or the gun rights side of things, I want to start with the definition. Because sanctuary city is thrown around on cable news constantly, but I feel like the actual legal meaning gets lost in all the shouting.
It absolutely does.
So based on the text we have, what is a sanctuary city really?
If we strip away all the rhetoric and just look at the definition in the source material, it's actually quite narrow. And that surprises people. A sanctuary city or county or state, for that matter, is simply a municipality that limits local law enforcement cooperation with federal efforts to deport undocumented immigrants.
Limits cooperation. That seems like a very polite, almost clinical way to put it.
It is specific legal language. It's fundamentally about limiting voluntary cooperation. It doesn't mean they're hiding people in basements.
Right.
It doesn't mean local laws don't apply. It doesn't mean that federal agents are banned from the city. It just means that where the local police force interacts with federal immigration enforcement, the local government has decided to draw a line and say, we aren't going to help you do your job.
So you can do it, but we won't help.
Exactly. We're not going to spend our resources, our personnel, or our time on it.
So it's passive resistance. Is that a fair way to characterize it?
In many ways, yes. I like to think of it as the difference between holding the door open for someone and just leaving it unlocked. You're not stopping them, but you're not facilitating it either.
Okay, I want to get very specific here. Because I think the average person imagines, the police pulling someone over, realizing they're undocumented, and just waving them goodbye.
Right, which isn't what happens.
But the sources describe a very specific workflow regarding something called a detainer request. Walk us through that, because this seems to be the real choke point.
It is. This is the whole ball game. To understand sanctuary, you have to understand the boring bureaucracy of getting arrested.
It's not like TV.
No, it's not like TV. There's a process. And it all hinges on what I call the fingerprint moment.
Okay, so I get arrested, let's say for shoplifting. Or maybe a traffic violation that went south. Something local.
Sure. A local crime. The local police arrest you. They take you to the local precinct or the county jail. They book you.
Right.
And part of that booking process, inevitably, is taking your fingerprints. They roll your fingers on the glass scanner. Now, those fingerprints don't just stay in a local filing cabinet in the basement of the precinct.
They go digital. They fly out into the cloud.
Correct. They are electronically sent to a massive shared database, the NCIC, the National Crime Information Center, that is accessed by the FBI and by ICE. Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
That is right.
Happens automatically. It's part of the modern policing infrastructure.
Yeah.
I mean, this was designed for catching serial killers and terrorists, sharing data across state lines. It's a very powerful system.
So ICE sees everyone who gets arrested, essentially. The moment my fingers hit the glass, an alarm goes off at an ICE headquarters somewhere.
Basically, yes. The moment those prints hit the system, ICE has visibility. Their systems run checks against their own databases. Now, if ICE analyzes those prints and identifies that the person who was just arrested for shoplifting is an unauthorized immigrant, maybe they have a prior deportation order, or maybe their visa expired years ago, they might decide they want to take custody of that person for deportation proceedings.
Okay, so they see me in the system. They want me. What happens next?
This is where the friction starts.
Okay.
The local police might be ready to release that person. Maybe they posted bail.
Or the charges were dropped.
Right. Maybe the shoplifting charges were dropped because the store owner didn't want to testify. Or maybe they just served their 2 days in jail for a misdemeanor. Under normal circumstances, that person walks out the front door.
Right. You do the crime, you do the time, you leave. That is how the justice system is supposed to work.
But ICE sees that release coming. They're monitoring the system. So they issue what is called a detainer request.
A detain.
Yes. It's a formal written request, usually in electronic form, Form I-247A, if you want to get technical, asking the local police to hold that person in the county jail for an extra 48 hours.
An extra 2 days.
An extra 2 days after they would normally be released.
Just to give ICE time to get there, like a reservation at a hotel.
Exactly. It's a logistical hold. Keep them locked up so our agents can drive over from their field office and pick them up.
Because ICE doesn't have agents on every corner. They might be 3 hours away.
Okay, so here is the million-dollar question. If the federal government, a big, powerful agency like ICE, asks the local police to hold someone, do the police have to say yes?
And that is where the constitutional rubber meets the road. According to the sources, and frankly settled Supreme Court doctrine, the answer is no. They do not have to say yes.
Explain why. Because usually when the feds ask for something, you give it to them. If the FBI asks for a file, you give them the file.
This comes down to the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and a legal concept called the anti-commandeering doctrine. Anti-commandeering, that sounds like something out of a pirate movie.
It's exactly what it sounds like. The legal principle is that the federal government cannot commandeer or seize control of state or local resources to enforce federal law.
You can't hijack their stuff.
You can't. Immigration is federal law. Local police enforce local and state law. The feds can't just treat the NYPD or the LA County Sheriff's Department like their own personal branch office.
So they can't force a local cop to do a federal agent's job.
Precisely. The Supreme Court has been very clear on this for a long time. The federal government can incentivize states, usually with money, we'll get to that later, but they cannot compel them. So, legally speaking, honoring that detainer request, holding that guy for an extra 48 hours, feeding him, guarding him, taking on the liability if he slips and falls in the cell, all of that is a voluntary act of cooperation. It is a choice.
That is a huge distinction. It's not breaking the law to say no. It's just choosing not to volunteer.
Precisely. And that is the space where sanctuary policies live in that gap of voluntary cooperation. The city is essentially saying, we aren't stopping you from arresting this person if you can find them on the street, but we aren't going to hold them for you in our jail, and we certainly aren't spending our city budget to do it.
So why would they say no? I mean, let's play devil's advocate for a second. If you're a city government and the feds say, hey, this person is here illegally, hold them for us, why refuse? Is it just to make a political point against the president? Is it just grandstanding?
It's easy to think it's just politics, especially with how hot the rhetoric gets. But the sources highlight a very practical, on-the-ground argument regarding what they call community trust.
Okay.
And this is the argument you hear from police chiefs in these cities. People who are usually pretty conservative, people who want to catch bad guys, not just from activists.
What is the community trust argument?
The argument is that policing, at its core, relies on information. You need witnesses to come forward. You need victims to call 911. You need people to talk to detectives when they're canvassing a neighborhood after a crime.
Sure. You can't solve a crime if nobody talks to you. It's impossible.
But if the local police are seen as de facto deportation agents, the immigrant community, which in many big cities is a huge part of the population, stops trusting them completely.
I see. The well of information dries up.
It evaporates. Imagine you're an undocumented immigrant, or maybe you're a citizen, but your mom or your spouse is undocumented. You live in a mixed status family, which is very common.
Right.
If you witness a murder, or if you are the victim of domestic violence, are you going to call 911 if you think that phone call could lead to your mom being deported?
Probably not. You'd stay silent, you'd take the abuse, or you'd just hope the killer doesn't come back rather than risk the deportation of your family.
Exactly. And that creates what police call a shadow population. It creates a class of victims who can't call the police, and more importantly, a class of criminals who know they can prey on those victims without any consequences.
That's a chilling thought. If the criminals know the victims can't call the cops, it's basically open season on that whole community.
That is the fear. So the argument from sanctuary jurisdictions is that by refusing to enforce federal immigration law, they're actually making the city safer for everyone because it keeps those lines of communication open. They want the grandmother to feel safe reporting the gang activity on the corner, regardless of her visa status. They believe that's a bigger public safety win.
So it's a trade-off. They are prioritizing local crime reporting and investigation over federal immigration enforcement.
That's the calculation they're making. They argue that this vulnerability for one part of the community actually hinders overall public safety for everyone. If you break trust with 20% of your population, you can't police the city effectively, period.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It shifts the perspective from, the political rhetoric of protecting criminals to the practical argument of protecting the ability to police the community.
Precisely. It's a pragmatic argument, not just an ideological one.
Okay, so that's the theory, that's the mechanics. But I want to see how this evolved, because it didn't just appear out of nowhere in 2016. The sources give us a really detailed timeline of New York City, and it's fascinating because it spans decades and different political parties.
It is. New York is really the perfect case study to see how this policy matured from a very small idea into a massive conflict with the federal government.
So let's go back. We are talking about the 1980s. Ed Koch is the mayor.
The 1980s, a very different time in New York. High crime, high tension, the crack epidemic is just starting. And Mayor Koch issues an executive order. Now remember, this isn't a modern woke policy. This is Ed Koch. How am I doing? Koch.
Right. Not exactly a radical leftist. He was a pretty moderate law and order kind of guy.
Very much so. The order simply prohibited city agencies from sharing immigrant information with the feds unless criminal activity was suspected.
Unless criminal activity was suspected.
Yeah.
That seems like a pretty reasonable bar, actually.
It was the baseline. It was a privacy protection, essentially. And the goal, at the time, was mostly about public health and education.
How so?
Well, if an immigrant went to a public hospital with tuberculosis or sent their kid to a public school, the city needed them to do that. They didn't want the fear of deportation to turn a treatable illness into a plague or have thousands of kids not in school.
Right. If people are too scared to go to the emergency room, you have a public health crisis that affects everyone, citizen or not. If kids aren't in school, they're on the street. It's a public safety issue.
Exactly. It was pragmatic. It wasn't about ideology. It was about running a functional city.
Hmm.
But then, fast forward to 1996, the federal government decides they don't like this.
The empire strikes back.
In a way, Congress passed a major immigration reform law in 1996, our ERA it was called, that explicitly prevented local governments from withholding information from federal agents.
Yeah.
They tried to ban these sanctuary policies by statute. They said, you cannot have a rule that stops people from talking to us.
So how did New York react? Did they fold? Did they say, okay, Congress wins, we'll get rid of the Koch order?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting politically. The mayor at the time was Rudy Giuliani.
Rudy Giuliani. Now, most listeners know him today as a very staunch conservative, tough-on-crime figure, very much aligned with strict immigration enforcement.
Right, America's mayor. But in 1996, Mayor Giuliani actually challenged this federal law in court. He fought for the sanctuary policy.
Wait, Giuliani fought to protect undocumented immigrants from the feds. That doesn't sound like the Rudy we know today.
He fought to protect the city's right to manage its own affairs. His argument was almost identical to the Koch-era argument. He needed undocumented people to report crimes and send their kids to school to keep the city functional and safe. He famously said, if you come here and you work hard, we want you to have the opportunity to participate. He sued the federal government. He lost that court battle, by the way. The courts upheld the federal law. But it just goes to show you that this wasn't always a neatly divided partisan issue.
That is fascinating. It was about home rule versus Washington.
Exactly. It was a mayor saying, I know how to run my city better than you do from 1,000 miles away.
So the policy survives, even though he lost the court case, but it changes.
It evolves. It has to adapt. So we move into the 2000s. Mayor Michael Bloomberg takes office. In 2003, he issues what we might call the Don't Ask order.
The don't ask phase.
Yes. He forbade city employees, cops, teachers, social workers from even inquiring about immigration status in many, many situations.
So if you don't ask, you don't have the information to give to the feds, even if they demand it under the 1996 law.
Smart, right. You can't withhold what you don't have. It was a clever way to comply with the letter of the 1996 law, which said you can't withhold info while still maintaining the spirit of the sanctuary protections. You just ensure the info never gets generated in the first place.
Lawyers, gotta love them. Always finding the loophole.
It's a classic legal workaround. But then we get to 2014, and Mayor Bill de Blasio, and this is where we see the modern, robust sanctuary definition really lock into place. This is the escalation.
What changed with de Blasio? How did he up the ante?
It was a significant expansion, a quantum leap, really. He didn't just limit information sharing. He issued orders preventing police and jails from assisting ICE agents with deportations at all, unless there were very serious violent felonies involved and a judicial warrant.
So he basically said no to those detainer requests we talked about.
Almost entirely. But
Yep.
the source mentions a specific detail about access that is really crucial here. It's a game changer.
Yeah, I saw that. It wasn't just about data anymore. It was about physical space.
De Blasio added provisions preventing ICE agents from even entering city buildings without a warrant.
Wow, so an ICE agent couldn't just walk into a police precinct or a city jail to interview someone or pick them up.
Not without a judicial warrant signed by a judge. And that is a massive shift. It moved the policy from passive non-cooperation, just not sharing data, to active blocking. It made ICE's job significantly harder logistically.
And I imagine that really cranked up the tension between the NYPD and the feds.
Incredibly so. It turned city property into a literal sanctuary where federal agents couldn't easily go. It treated federal agents almost like they were civilians. You can't come in here without a warrant. It's a direct confrontation.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have established what a sanctuary city is.
Look.
We've seen how it grew in New York from a simple privacy rule to a full-on keep-out sign. And usually the conversation stops there.
Right.
We argue about whether that's good or bad for the country, and we go home.
But if you stop there, you miss the bigger picture. You miss the evolution of the tactic itself.
Here's where it gets really interesting. While everyone was focused on New York and California and immigration, the sources show a massive movement developing on the other side of the political spectrum, and they are using the exact same playbook.
It really is a perfect mirror image.
Mhm.
It's uncanny. We are talking about the constitutional sanctuary, or more commonly, the Second Amendment sanctuary movement.
So instead of protecting undocumented immigrants from deportation, these sanctuaries are protecting gun owners from gun control laws.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
And the logic, the legal reasoning is identical. The argument is that the federal government, or sometimes the state government, is overstepping its authority and infringing on a constitutional right.
So what exactly are they protecting against? What is the specific motivation here?
The sources say they are countering what they view as federal and state-level centralization and restrictions on the Second Amendment. They're worried about potential red flag laws.
Explain that for listeners who may not know.
Sure. A red flag law allows police or family members to petition a court to temporarily remove firearms from a person who may present a danger to themselves or others.
Okay.
They're also worried about bans on certain types of magazines or rifles. And they assert a very fundamental principle, that no agency, no executive order, and no state law can supersede the Bill of Rights.
So if a new federal law says you can't own this type of rifle, a Second Amendment sanctuary county says, we believe that law is unconstitutional, so we aren't going to enforce it within our borders.
That is the stance. They are claiming the right to interpret the Constitution locally and refuse to comply with laws they believe violate it.
Wait, isn't that what the Supreme Court is for? Interpreting the Constitution? That seems like a pretty big overstep for a county commissioner.
That's the counter-argument, absolutely. Critics would say you aren't a judge, you're a county commissioner. But these counties are arguing that they have a duty not to enforce unconstitutional laws, even before the Supreme Court rules on them.
So they're getting ahead of the courts.
They're essentially preemptively striking down the law within their borders. They view the Constitution as a contract, and they believe the feds are breaking it. So they are declaring noncompliance.
Let's look at the how. Because with immigration, we talked about detainer requests and jail access. What does a gun sanctuary look like on the ground? What do they actually do?
The sources give us some really specific examples from the county level, which is where most of this action is happening. Let's look at Indian River County, Florida.
Okay, Indian River, what did they do?
They had a unanimous vote. The Board of Commissioners and the sheriff got together. The sheriff publicly pledged not to enforce unconstitutional federal directives.
Unconstitutional federal directives. That's pretty broad language, isn't it? Who decides what is unconstitutional in that scenario?
In this context, the sheriff.
The sheriff decides.
Yes. It leaves a massive amount of discretion to the local sheriff to decide what is and isn't constitutional. If a new regulation comes down from the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the sheriff might look at it and say, nope, that violates the Second Amendment in my view. We aren't doing it here.
What about Ottawa County, Michigan? I saw that in the notes, and it sounded really familiar.
Ottawa County is interesting because they went straight for the wallet. They voted not to use funds or resources to enforce laws restricting constitutional rights.
Wait, that sounds exactly like the argument the sanctuary cities use for immigration. We're not spending our money on it.
It is the exact same legal mechanism.
Yeah.
It is the exact same tool. It's the we're not helping strategy. We aren't stopping you, feds, but we aren't spending a single dime of our local tax money to help you confiscate weapons or enforce your new regulations.
It is the exact same loophole. We are just managing our budget.
Exactly. It's fiscal federalism, weaponized. They're saying, we have a limited budget, and we choose not to spend it on enforcing your gun laws. Cattaraugus County in New York did something similar. They pledged to use all legal means to oppose infringements.
And then you have places like Elko and Lander counties in Nevada.
Nevada, the Wild West.
Literally.
They focused their resolutions on the idea of natural rights. They took a stand against both state and federal authorities. And this is an important distinction. Sometimes these counties are fighting their own state governments.
Right, because if you are a conservative county in a liberal state like a red county in New York or Illinois or Nevada, you might feel like the state capital is just as hostile to your rights as Washington, D.C. is.
Exactly. So they declare themselves a sanctuary from the state capital as well. They're drawing a circle around their county and saying, state law, if it violates the Constitution, stops at the county line.
That brings up a really key player in this version of the sanctuary movement. In the immigration version, we talk a lot about Mayors de Blasio, Kouf, Giuliani, but in the gun rights version, it seems like it's all about the sheriff.
The sheriff is pivotal here. In the American system, the sheriff is a unique office. A police chief is appointed by a mayor or a city council. They're an employee. They can be fired.
Right. They serve at the pleasure of the mayor. If they don't do what the mayor wants, they're gone.
But a sheriff is an elected constitutional officer. In most states, their office is enshrined in the state constitution. They answer directly to the voters, not the mayor or the governor. They have their own independent power base.
So they have a lot more independence to, well, to just say no.
A huge amount. And they often view themselves as the ultimate protector of their constituents' rights, even against higher levels of government. The source highlights a fascinating example from Utah regarding this very point.
What happened in Utah?
Every single sheriff in the state of Utah signed a joint letter.
Every sheriff. Even the ones in the cities, like Salt Lake.
Every single one. 29 of them. They pledged to safeguard the Second Amendment against any federal overreach. And the source makes a key insight here that I want to read directly. It says, lack of enforcement by local law enforcement renders unconstitutional laws ineffective.
That is a powerful sentence. Lack of enforcement renders laws ineffective.
It's the core mechanic of both sanctuary types. It's the whole strategy in one sentence. You don't need to overturn the law in the Supreme Court. You don't need to win an election in Washington. If the guy with the badge who pulls you over decides not to write the ticket or not to confiscate the weapon, the law essentially doesn't exist in that county.
It effectively nullifies the law on the street level without a judge ever banging a gavel.
Exactly. It is nullification by inaction. It's the pocket veto of law enforcement.
So what does this all mean for the map of America? Because when we talk about sanctuary cities for immigration, we're usually talking about the big blue dots, LA, NYC, Chicago, San Francisco.
Right. Major urban centers, massive populations, but geographically, they're relatively small areas.
But when I looked at the data for these Second Amendment sanctuaries, I was honestly shocked by the scale. I had no idea it had spread this far.
It is staggering. It's one of those things that has happened relatively quietly, county by county, but when you zoom out, the picture is just overwhelming. According to the map data in the source, around 70% of U.S. counties are currently designated as Second Amendment sanctuary.
50%.
7-0.
7-0. Now, think about what that looks like on a map. That is a sea of red covering the vast majority of the American landscape. It's almost everywhere except the major urban centers and their immediate suburbs.
That is massive. That is a fundamental redrawing of the legal map of the country. But I have to ask, is it just a symbolic thing? Like, we support the Second Amendment, they put a plaque on the courthouse wall and call it a day? Or does it have teeth? That is the right question to ask. And the answer is, it varies. The source breaks down the levels of protection. For some counties, yes, it's a resolution, a statement of values, an executive proclamation. It signals to the voters, we are on your side. It's political messaging.
Okay, so the polite letter version, Dear Congress, we are unhappy.
Right. But for others, it goes much further. It extends to passing local ordinances with teeth or pushing for constitutional carry legislation at the state level.
Explain that for the listener who might not know the term constitutional carry.
Constitutional carry, sometimes called permitless carry, means you can carry a handgun, either openly or concealed, without a license or a permit. The idea is that the Second Amendment of the Constitution is your permit. You don't need to ask the government for permission to exercise a right.
And how widespread is that? Is that just a fringe idea?
Not at all. The source notes that 28 states, including Texas, Ohio, Louisiana, have constitutional carry laws now.
28 states, that's more than half the country.
It is. The movement has been incredibly successful at the state level. And we even see entire states declaring themselves sanctuaries. The former governor of Nebraska declared the whole state a Second Amendment sanctuary state via proclamation.
So we have sanctuary cities for immigrants and sanctuary states for guns.
We are seeing the balkanization of American law. Depending on where you stand geographically, your rights and your relationship with the federal government look completely fundamentally different.
This raises a really important question. If everyone is just opting out of the laws they don't like, surely the federal government doesn't just sit there and take it. You can't just ignore federal law without consequences, can you?
No, you cannot. And this is where the two stories, the left-wing and the right-wing sanctuary movements, converge again. The federal government and state governments have a very powerful tool to force compliance. It's not usually the military. It's not usually arresting the sheriff.
It's the cost of resistance.
It's the checkbook. It's always the money.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because we see the exact same punishment tactics used against both sides. It's the same playbook again.
The empire strikes back with money. When a city or county says no to the feds threaten cut off the money supply. This is classic coercive federalism.
Let's talk about the specific examples from the text. We mentioned Texas earlier.
Yes. In 2017, the state of Texas, which is obviously very conservative, went after its own liberal cities, like Austin and Houston. The state government passed a law, SB4, that essentially withheld funding from local police departments that refused to comply with ICE detainer requests.
So the state said, if you don't help ICE, we won't give you grant money for body armor or patrol cars or officer training.
Exactly. They squeezed the budget to force compliance. You want to be a sanctuary? Fine, but you're going to be a poor sanctuary. They passed a law essentially outlawing sanctuary cities within Texas and threatening police chiefs with jail time.
And then at the federal level, we saw the same thing.
We saw it with President Trump. In January 2017, just days after taking office, he signed an executive order to potentially withhold federal funds from sanctuary cities nationwide.
That was a huge news story at the time. I remember the headlines. It felt like a declaration of war on those cities.
It was. But the source notes something interesting. The order was described as vague.
Vague how? What does that mean?
It wasn't clear exactly which funds could be cut.
Right.
And that is a critical legal detail. The Supreme Court has ruled in the past that the federal government can't just bully states by taking away unrelated money.
Okay.
You can't cut highway funding just because a city won't enforce immigration law. There has to be a connection, a nexus between the money and the policy. So the vagueness of the order led to a lot of court challenges.
So it creates this weird limbo for the cities and counties.
It creates a massive dilemma for local law enforcement. Imagine you're a police chief or a sheriff on either side of this. On one hand, you have your principles, whether that's community trust for the immigrant community or constitutional rights for the gun owners. You believe you're doing the right thing. You believe you are protecting your people, which is your primary job.
Right. You were elected or appointed to uphold those values for your community.
On the other hand, you have a budget to balance. You need federal grants to hire officers, to buy equipment, to keep the lights on in the station. So you have to weigh financial security against your principles. Do you sell out your values for a federal grant? Or do you stand your ground and lay off deputies?
That is a tough spot to be in. It's a game of chicken with the federal government or the state government, and you don't have nearly as much power.
It is. And because the legal ground is shifting, with court cases like the challenge to the Trump order and new lawsuits every day, locals are often unsure of the real ground rules. They're operating in a fog of war. They don't know if the funding cut is real or if it's just a threat.
So what does this all mean? We've looked at the mechanics, the history in NYC, the explosion of gun sanctuaries, and now the funding wars. How do we tie this all together?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the story isn't really about guns or immigrants. It's about the location of power in America.
Say more about that. What do you mean, the location of power?
Well, we grow up learning about the supremacy clause in civics class, that federal law is the supreme law of the land. We learn that if Congress passes a bill and the president signs it, that's the law. End of story.
Right. The old Schoolhouse Rock cartoon, I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill.
Exactly. But what the sources are showing us is that enforcement is local. And because enforcement is local, power is local. A law that isn't enforced is just a piece of paper in a book in a library. It has no teeth.
The person who decides whether the law applies to you isn't the president signing a bill in the Oval Office. It's the sheriff standing next to your car window.
Precisely. We started this deep dive looking at NYC mayors refusing to open their jail cells to ICE. We ended with Utah sheriffs refusing to enforce federal gun laws. The common thread is the power of the local level to essentially nullify federal or state intent by simply refusing to cooperate.
By refusing to open the door or the jail cell or the wallet.
Its passive resistance on a systemic scale is a reassertion of local control in an era where everything feels like it's being decided hundreds or thousands of miles away in Washington.
So why should our listener care? I mean, maybe they aren't an undocumented immigrant and maybe they don't own a gun. Maybe they live in a suburb and think, this doesn't affect me. Why does this matter to you, the person listening to this right now?
Because the battleground for American law and rights is shifting to your backyard. We are used to looking at Washington, D.C. for the direction of the country. But these sources suggest that your local county board of commissioners or your local sheriff or your city council, they might be making decisions that effectively override Washington, D.C. for you.
Your rights and your neighbor's rights might depend more on your zip code than on the text of the Constitution.
That is exactly right. Whether you care about immigration or gun rights or even other issues that are coming up in the future, abortion access, environmental regulations, drug laws, this sanctuary mechanism is now a proven playbook. It's out there. Both sides know how to use it now. If you want to change policy, You don't just march on Washington anymore, you march on your local city hall.
Which leads to a pretty provocative thought to end on. We often think of the law of the land as this solid, unified thing written in the Capitol. But if 70% of counties can effectively opt out of gun laws, and the nation's major metropolises can opt out of immigration laws, do we actually have a unified national law anymore?
That is the question, isn't it?
Or are we becoming a patchwork of independent city-states and county-states where the rules change every time you cross a county line? It's something to mull over the next time you see a Welcome to County name sign on the highway. You might be entering a different legal reality than the one you just left.
It's a fascinating and I think slightly unsettling new reality.
It certainly is. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us. We'll see you next time.
Take care.
They write the law so far away in rooms we'll never see. But dirt and boots and open roads decide what it will be. It shows up strong with borrowed words, says this is how it stands. But nothing moves unless it's moved by flesh and blood and hands. You can say it loud, you can say it proud, but words don't walk this land. A badge is worn by human hands, by hearts that choose their stand. Power taught